Welcome to the Revenue Builders Podcast, a weekly show featuring B2B sales leaders and executives. Hosted by five-time CRO John McMahon and Force Management co-founder John Kaplan, the show goes behind the scenes with the people who have been there, done that, and seen the results. If you enjoy our content, please subscribe, rate, and review the show to help us reach more people. Revenue Builders is brought to you by Force Management. We help companies improve sales performance, executing the growth strategy at the point of sale. Find us at forcemanagement.com. Enjoy today's episode.
Hello and welcome to the Revenue Builders Podcast. I'm John Kaplan with five-time CRO and author of the wildly successful book, The Qualified Sales Leader, my good friend, John McMahon. Johnny, how are you, buddy?
Doing great, Cap. I'm interested in what our guest has to say today, so I'm pretty excited.
Oh, me too. Me too, brother. Hey, let's get into it. Zack Rosenburg co-founded SBP in 2006 after Hurricane Katrina. He plays a direct role in the advisement of state and local government officials to help create long-term recovery programs. Zack has been featured in Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, Politico, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, and has been recognized as a New Orleanian of the Year and Mid-Atlantic Innocence Project Champion of Justice, and received the Manhattan Institute Social Innovation Award. Before founding SBP, Zack was a teaching fellow at the Georgetown University Law Center, and he ran a criminal defense practice in Washington, D.C. Zack received his BA from Ohio Wesleyan University and a JD from the American University Washington School of Law, and holds an honorary doctorate from Muhlenberg College and Distinguished Alumnus Award from Washington College of Law. Johnny, please welcome our guest, Zack Rosenburg.
Hey, Zack, excited to have you, bud. Welcome.
Thanks. Thrilled to be with you guys. Thank you, fellas.
You're welcome. Hey, we got an intro from you. It was really an interesting timing because we got an intro to you from our good friend, Chris Rysick, who I know is a good friend of yours. And it was right around the time of Hurricane Ian, where both Johnny and I have places down in Florida. And it was just really kind of an interesting time to get an introduction to you. So we'll dig into a little bit more of that as we go through this. But Zack, you have such an interesting and powerful background of service, and we're going to dig into that. I'd love to just kind of get started with you telling us a little bit about, what you do. I'd like to hear more about SBP. Started off with that, SBP, and what it's focused on and why it's needed. And that'll be a good way for us to kind of get started.
Yeah, thanks, John. So SBP started in St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, which is the neighborhood right next to the lower Ninth Ward. Before Katrina, I'd never been in St. Bernard Parish in my life. I'd go to Jazz Fest every year for about 8 years before Katrina happened. When Katrina happened, like so many other Americans, I wrote a check. Right, felt like the right thing to do, and kind of went on with my life. And at that point, I was representing indigent people, poor people accused of crime. And I was representing this one guy, Ed Burns, and he had a really hairy case. He was innocent, but it wasn't clear the courts of law were going to find him innocent. He didn't do it. He was accused of attempted murder. So every day for about 8 months, I was going to bed thinking about Mr. Burns. I was waking up in the middle of the night thinking about Mr. Burns. I was waking up in the morning thinking about Mr. Burns. And even when I was talking to people, I was thinking about Mr. Burns. Tried his case. He was found not guilty. It was a big deal. And I wanted to do anything besides think about Mr. Burns. And my wife at that point, who was my girlfriend, is my better two-thirds, had just gotten a grad degree from George Washington was switching jobs, and her mom happened to have, she was retiring as a nurse midwife. So the three of us decided to go to New Orleans for 2 weeks and help. It just felt like something we'd do, and then we'd get back to our lives. And Liz sent out about 30 emails to all the big groups. Hey, we're going to help. What can we do? What can we bring? And we heard from one group, a bunch of hippies who were feeding people in St. Bernard Parish. They were funded by the United Way, and they were feeding people. And at that point, we thought, maybe we missed it. The recovery must be over. This New Orleans, if you think back to the early 90s, like oil was on our minds as it's becoming again. Third of the country's oil goes through Louisiana. Everybody knows New Orleans. Disasters happen. 6 months after the storm must be over. When we got there, it wasn't over. It hadn't started. We saw cars on top of houses, houses on top of cars. But what was most compelling and poignant and heartbreaking for us is seeing people who had achieved this element of American success, right? People who own their own homes. I had done poverty work my whole life. I thought if you buy a house, you're going to be okay. Things can only get but so bad. And we saw these people, veterans, the Korean War veteran, police officer Bob Buris, World War II veteran Mr. Andre, right? These hardworking folks who were sleeping in attics and cars and garages. And so we spent 2 weeks feeding them, cooking. We slept in tents. We joined the hippies. We didn't have long hair, but we were in it, feeding people. And we got to know these folks really, really well. These were people, like so many folks impacted by disaster, who had never asked for help before in their lives. Asking for help was anathema to who they were. It just wasn't what they did. They helped. One woman, Dawn Nunez, wrote a poem about it. And all they wanted was to move home. And so after 2 weeks, we didn't think we could tell these folks, like, all right, y'all, good luck. Have a nice life. Hang in there. We thought, let's do the easy thing, or let's do what we can do. Let's go back to DC and raise some money for whoever's going to do the rebuilding. And so we went to all the big groups again and said, when are you going to start building? And it was like they were reading off a script saying, we've done disaster recovery the same way for 30 years. Can't change. Why would we change? Building's the third phase, and you can't do the third phase until you do the first and the second. So we told them the pound sand would figure it out ourselves. And on a lark, we kind of moved there. We kept my law practice. We needed income. We thought we'd just build houses, the two of us. Long story short, or maybe not as short as it should have been, and my team will say it's definitely not as short as it should have been. We started SBP. At that point, it was called the St. Bernard Project, with the mission of rebuilding homes for Katrina survivors. It's since turned into this national entity. We got really good at building houses. We can tell you how we did that based on the Toyota production system. But most importantly, we learned that the building houses was reactive, right? It was waiting till after people suffered. It could never get to scale. And if we really cared about clients, we really loved our clients, the answer can't be more Band-Aids. The answer had to be, and maybe we'll go into this, how do you put yourself out of business, right? And how do you obviate the need to be putting Band-Aids on? And so we expanded SBP's remit to upstream solutions that fortify people against their breaking point. We make sure the government programs work. We try and increase the amount of people who have flood insurance. We teach people to make their homes more resilient before disaster and navigate recovery after, including employees of companies. And then we work on system change interventions as well. And we also support other nonprofit groups. Long way of saying SBP exists to reduce the time between disaster and recovery and fortify people against preventable suffering.
So, Zack, 2 questions based upon what you said. So it sounds like going down there initially was just a little bit of a distraction, and it touched you personally once you were down there, but there had to be something more than just a distraction that touched you personally to go down there in the first place. What was that?
Man, I wish I could say there was something profound. We just wanted to help. Liz had some time between jobs and we just wanted to help. And then seeing people, it was striking for me to see people who weren't in poverty before. And we didn't have a language for what we saw at that point, John, but they were at risk of being pushed beyond their breaking point. And some of them were suicide, given up on life, alive, but not living.
Sure.
Later on, we figured out what the real issue was. It was the breaking point. And there's three things that drive the breaking point. And that's where we, as a business, we're a nonprofit group, but we operate with the maniacal focus of a business. There's three things that lead to the breaking point: the amount of time between disaster and recovery, the amount of predictability that people have or lack thereof, right? We can grow our resilience if there's a clear path forward, regardless of how long it's going to take. But our resilience is decays if we're staring into this abyss of uncertainty. So time, predictability, and access to resources. And we saw people who were batting 0 for 3 and were ready to give up. Yeah. And that's where we spend all our time right now.
So, Zach, this hits home for me because my house in Florida was significantly affected by the recent Hurricane Ian. My entire first floor was wiped out. I lost my cars. And, it's 4 months later, I'm still living in a condo, and I feel lucky that I'm living in a condo and not in a car, while my house is being remediated. But what I've witnessed is the lack of time, supplies, and resources. What happens when one of these disasters comes in, from my perspective, is everybody's in the same predicament. So everything becomes a race against mold, which is one thing that if you don't live down in the South, you don't really think about. A race against mold, a race to find workers, a race to find materials, a race to find fans and dehumidifiers and generators, a race to find a car, a race to find a place to live. And in that process, also avoiding the multitude of con men that descend upon, a devastation, right? And in that race, there's people that move quickly and some that move slowly, like any race. And the slow ones lose their homes. Like just on my block, there were 6 homes that have already been knocked down because the people waited too long and the mold took over. So talk a little bit about the lack of time, resources, supplies, and how this is just like a race to rebuild and a race to survive.
Yeah, with potentially horrendous consequences.
Totally.
John, I'd been doing this for years until I had my son 10 years ago. And I thought I got it, right? I changed our life, right? We moved, we changed careers. It was a rough road. I thought I got it. Once I had my son and he was sort of a sentient being, it struck me differently. Not being able to answer the question to your kid when they ask, when are we going to move home, Mom? When are we going to be able to move home, Dad? Is everything going to be all right? Are we going to get in our house? The stakes are high. The stakes are different, but not different at different economic levels. Any way you cut it, it comes to predictability, time, and access to resources. And for folks who have means, it can be differently, excruciatingly challenging if you have the means, but you still don't have the access to the resources, the contractors, the supplies, the inspectors, the what have you. For folks with means often who are used to getting things done, you make one bad decision. You talked about the con men, whether it's the mold scammers or just the regular contractor frauders. If you, John, and I think we talked a number of months ago, and your listeners certainly can, you go to our website, we have learnings on focusing on avoiding contractor fraud. And it sounds like a jab your eye out topic, but the truth about mold, right? People needs to go to the truth about mold. I'll never forget in Slidell, Louisiana, there were about 3 years after Katrina, there was another storm that came through. Our team went out to Slidell, and there was, John, I told you about this. There was a a U.S. military man. I forget what his service was. He was deploying the next day. He paid $28,000 to a mold remediation company when he had 6 inches of water, just because he thought, I'm leaving. I got to make, this guy said, if you love your family, this is what you have to do. And he did it. So a lot of what we're doing at SBP is showing people the path forward. And then they participate, or we help them as we can, if that makes any sense. But it's a race with dire consequences.
Yeah, and people are vulnerable. One, like you said, they're emotional, and they're also vulnerable, and they're vulnerable to the con men, because somebody finally shows up. Because, like for me, I called worker after worker, plumber after electrician after worker, and they all say they're going to show up, and then they don't show up. So if you get somebody that shows up all of a sudden, you're like, okay, here comes the hero that's going to help me survive. So you're vulnerable and you're emotional, and it's pretty easy to be conned. And I'm sure the con men take advantage of that.
Well, they do. They say, all right, I'm here, but your neighbor wants me, or a guy 5 streets over wants me. So you got to pay now.
Yes.
Right. You got to pay cash. And I've seen savvy business people succumb to this dire pressure, and they have all the leverage in the world, right? It's from business, you think about the institutional actor advantage. And so part of what SBP is doing is trying to level the playing field through knowledge, through best practices. We have this app that we made in partnership with AT&T. It's called Equip, and it's checklist based. It's really geared for people's moms, right? Avoiding contractor fraud, the truth about mold, navigating FEMA, maximizing insurance, how to make your home more resilient. We tried to build it around the Checklist Manifesto, which is a book maybe you read. So we try at SBP, well, we are a nonprofit group. We have clients, and the clients don't want some hippy dippy group. They want a tenacious, focused entity. And we try and run it with the mindset of a maniacally focused business.
Yeah. Now, Zack, you also talked about like there's people with means and people without means. So now when we get to, let's say, the insurance companies, they move really slow. In some ways, I don't want to put a term on it, but they do know that people are vulnerable. They know they're emotional, and they know that they may not have the means. So in what I've witnessed with, not just myself, but other people that I know, they'll lowball the damage and reimbursement, hand the people a check, sign a release here. And now the people realize at some point, this money's never going to get my house back together again. So now I'm even in a worse bind. I get a check that basically gets me half of my house remediated, and the other half, I'm going to have to go take a loan out to get, the rest of it done. So the insurance companies are part of this also.
Yeah. So I would in my experience, I bifurcate the insurance companies.
You buy from what?
Bifurcate. So I separate.
Bifurcate. Okay. Yep.
The insurance companies. We have partnered with Farmers Insurance for the past 11 years. We never would have gotten to Joplin, Missouri, if it wasn't for Farmers Insurance. I know the just retired CEO, Jeff Daly, extraordinarily well. And he walked me through their business case of why doing the right thing is not just the right thing, it's the right business thing to do. It's not the cheapest insurance company,
right?
Farmers, but you're going to get good service there. Same thing with Travelers. We have an exceptional relationship with Travelers. They're the bigger name, non-bargain insurance companies.
Yeah, like Chubb and like Pure.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. And then there's
they're
some
really
smaller
good.
ones.
They come straightforward. But if you don't have those, bifurcated, you may be a vulnerable victim.
Incredibly vulnerable. And if you think about it, John, there's the people who can't afford to pay mortgage and rent at the same time.
Right.
And so then you have a choice. You have cash on the table, right? Or you can fight and maybe you have a good chance, maybe you don't. And that's where people lose. There is a lens of racial equity here as well. 2 houses in an African-American neighborhood and a white neighborhood built at the same time, built the same way. same damage. When the federal government programs and when the insurance payments are based on appraised value rather than based on cost of repair, the folks in the African American neighborhoods and the African American people get less money. So there is a lens of racial equity here that is rough. And we've all read over the past, it's gone on for a while, but we've read a lot recently how the same house in different neighborhoods built the same way is appraised very differently in a black neighborhood and a white neighborhood.
Well, I could get
or
that.
You guys,
why don't they change it to the cost to repair versus the cost of appraisal? Because the appraisal costs are always going to be different, no matter what the neighborhoods are. But the cost to repair, that should be the benchmark, no?
That, yes, you're spot on. Yeah, man. Yeah, there's some articles I'll send you and you can post to this if you wish, but absolutely. But that's an uphill battle. HUD is getting it better. Some insurance companies are getting it better, not all of them. And it's we got to get the system right. Like SVP can go. Last year, we built over 600 houses. We funded nonprofit groups and taught them the Toyota production system that built another 600 houses, 1,200 families home. On one hand, you pat yourself on the back. It's great. But if we really care about people, we got to get the system right. And so we got to get the compensation methods right. We got to prevent this process. And I hope, John, you didn't have to deal with this, where you're applying 3 different times. You apply to HUD or you apply to FEMA.
FEMA, yeah.
They're going to reject you. You cannot max out at FEMA unless they reject you. Then you have to go through appeals process. And we'll come back to that. Then you apply to SBA. Then some people end up applying to HUD. We have a piece of legislation that was brought in the last Congress. They didn't vote on it yet. That would allow a one app for all federal assistance, just like FAFSA. You apply once, they pull your tax information, and it applies to all government systems. The way it works right now, it's designed to drive attrition. You apply to FEMA. You have to get rejected. They send you to SBA. You can't get maximum FEMA unless SBA sends you back. FEMA in their own language, and they've gotten so much better, and the people really try. They expect it to be a negotiation. They see it a dialogue, yet only 2% of the people appeal. SVP is running FEMA appeals. We have an over 70% success rate. And on average, we're doubling people's FEMA claims. So that shows. Sure. Sorry.
No, I'm sure that you.
Yeah, man. But the big problem is, so if we do 1,000 FEMA appeals a year, but only 2% of the people are appealing. So that goes to your point. Let's get the systems right. And at SVP, that's something we're thinking about.
Now, Zach, what about these independent insurance adjusters? For people that don't know what that is, if your house is destroyed, sometimes and the insurance company tries to lowball you, then again, in this bifurcated system, not Farmers or Chubb,
right?
But if they try to lowball you and you have the means to say, no, I'll wait until I can get the right amount, then you can hire, and sometimes there's flim-flam men in this also, there's independent insurance adjusters. And what they'll do is they'll basically look at a wall and they'll go, okay, that's 3 pieces of sheetrock times a price. It's going to take 2 gallons of plaster times a price, 2 gallons of paint times a price. And they literally itemize every little thing that has to be done. Yeah. Then they take that to the insurance company and they say, okay, what do you want to argue about? And that's when the insurance company says, okay, you got us. And then they write a much bigger check. Is that basically the same thing that SPP is trying to do?
We do that with FEMA now. Precisely that. We get what's called an exactimate estimate. So that's the tool that's used by FEMA to do their compensation. And so we have independent contractors doing exactimate estimates. And that's the main reason why. And we're causing the FEMA adjusters just to spend more time. But John, you're spot on. People 100% of the time, if they're dissatisfied, should explore using third-party adjusters.
Right.
Oftentimes, it just gets the insurance company's attention, and they do the right thing. And they can't act in bad faith. You start talking about treble damages for bad faith once the insurance companies know something, then they'll take it a little bit more seriously. But you got to advocate. And for a lot of people who are working, who are paying rent and mortgage at the same time, or living in a car or a house or garage or an attic, or with doubled or tripled up with family members. And again, like, these are people who aren't used to asking for help. The system's designed for attrition. So they give up and they lose that hard-won equity in the house, that like fundamental bedrock of American like ascending financially, the equity in your house, and they lose it overnight because the system is designed to push them on the side, and they lose that equity and other people swoop in.
Right. And then they'll fight you so maybe you can get the house repaired, but they'll fight you for the contents. So, well, did that rug and that couch and that table really cost that much? Show us pictures of the damage. Show us pictures that it was give us the receipts. I mean, they make it so laborious that, to your point, you almost want to give up because you feel like you're fighting the system. Every time you send something in, they send you something back saying you didn't put it in the right format. You didn't put it in our system format. You don't have this. You don't have that. It's almost like they just have a bunch of people on the other side that say, nope.
This is feeling very personal, Mr. McMahon. Very personal.
Well, yes. Well, because I've been through this twice, once with Ian and one time up in Massachusetts. Yeah. So I have a couple scars on my back from this stuff. And I can empathize with all the people that go through this stuff. And I'm witnessing it still around me where I live right now in Florida.
Yeah, it's really hard for folks. The exceptional can get through it, but normal folks, I don't know that I could. We have a value at SBP that's called the mom rule. And it boils down to doing the work the way you'd want it done if it was your own mother. And for our own policies, if people are applying for help, or if we're working with people or designing a program, we really think, if this was our mother, would this be a system we feel fair about? We want the federal government to have that same approach. We want the state governments to have that same approach. And sometimes they do. So part of what we do is we train city and state disaster leaders to design and run their programs. We hired the team, we had the leader and then part of the team who worked for Governor Haley in South Carolina, who ran the fastest recovery on record. Guy named J.R. Sanderson, retired Army colonel, taught at the War College, and he got dollars out the door in month 13, fastest on record, wrapped it up in 5 years. So his job and his team's job now is to work with other disaster leaders who are in charge of billions of dollars to focus on outcomes, not just compliance.
So Zach, talk to us a little bit. You built 600 houses last year, if I remember what you said.
Yes, sir.
And you used what you called the Toyota production method. I'm not familiar with that. Our audience probably isn't. Could you educate us?
Yeah. So TPS, or the Toyota Production System, is a management philosophy on how to constantly improve, and drive efficiency. Toyota came to us after about 5 years of work. I met the woman who ran their foundation, Pat Pineda, at a conference where some other disaster group, I won't name them, and they were polished and they had a ton of money and they had a celebrity, right? This guy is a good looking guy, nothing like me, tall, great hair, really expensive suit, gives the pitch to all these corporate executives. And I was nervous. And then he came to his price tag, and their aspirational price, not what they were actually building for, but their target price was double our price. Like, all right, we got it. And it turned out we did really well. I met Pat after, who ran Toyota's foundation, and I asked her to teach us how to build houses the way they build cars. They invested money in us would spend it appropriately. But if they gave us knowledge, it would make us a smarter business. They have a team that trains both competitors, for-profit companies, and we were one of the first nonprofit companies. So they spent 2 weeks, or they came twice a month, 3 days each, for 9 months, looking at our processes. The first thing they asked us was if we talk about problems. And this was a time, John, when we had Liz won the CNN Hero Award. We were on the cover of US News and World Report. We were building more houses than anyone else. We were building 100 houses a year in New Orleans. We were only in New Orleans then. No one was close to it. We were the good guys. And they asked us if we talked, but we had plateaued. They asked us if we talked about problems. And I nodded. The team was near me. I didn't see them all shaking their head. So first of all, we have to change our culture. You guys, I'm sure, have read Good to Great, where they talked about Hewlett Packard. They were the company that turned over the rock to look at the ugly things. That was their culture. That wasn't our culture. We didn't talk about problems. Second, they asked us if we were ahead or behind. And we said, of what? I mean, we had no idea. We were just working hard. We valued working on a ton of houses. I think we had 30 or 40 going at a time, rather than every house, every component for each day, are we ahead or behind? So we spent 9 months working with these guys, and we ended up reducing construction time by 48%, from 120 something days to 61 days a house. It was a big deal.
61 days for a house is phenomenal.
Yeah. More than that, though, there were a couple things that were even more important. We learned this notion of Yokoten, which means if you do it well, share it. So here's Toyota, right? Big company. They trained competitors to use the Toyota production system. They train hospitals, they train Herman Miller chairs, a whole bunch of general industry partners. So we became this notion. We thought, all right, if a for-profit global company can take their resources to drive efficiency with others, we can do the same thing. And that's what started our share intervention, when we began not just investing money, but time, resources in the Toyota production system. We thought, John, about the mom rule. If my mom was impacted, I wouldn't care if it's the people in the yellow shirts, the blue shirts, the green shirts, the turquoise shirts rebuilding the houses. So we realized for success for clients didn't just mean SBP doing more. It meant raising the efficacy of the industry. So that's the first thing we learned. Second, we learned we had to apply TPS across everything that we did, right? Driving greater efficiency. And by doing so, that's how we realized that just being reactive wasn't enough. Just building houses wasn't enough. If we really cared, they talked about upstream solution, the best upstream, and they talked about what would the customer want. Think about it. Would the customer want us to rebuild their house? Or would they want never to need our help in the first place? And so that's when we broke out our other work of, if you thought about what would you want? First of all, you'd want a resilient house. Next, you'd want the right insurance that you could access. If for whatever reason you didn't have the right insurance, you'd want the government programs to work. And then if none of that works, you need a nonprofit group. Well, you really wouldn't care who it was. So that's why SBP does so much right now, because we've focused on the business question, or the Toyota question of what would the customer want.
Yeah, I loved in our initial conversation, Zach, this part right here, I thought would be tremendous value. It's all tremendous value for listeners. But no matter what you do for a living, the way you, and I wrote it down, the way you explained the TPS model to me, you said every day measuring whether you are ahead or behind, and why too much in either direction is a problem. That really made me think about my own business. It's not whether or not you're ahead or behind, but how much and in which way comes up all the time. And I thought it was just really, really profound. The other thing you said a culture safe to talk about problems. Now, you just described it as, focusing on the customer problem, which was customer centricity, which you listed for me is one of the tenets of TPS. But a culture safe to talk about problems, meaning if the crap's not working, the culture supports the ability for people to talk about what's not working. And there's a lot of cultures that we interact with where people don't know how to bring that up. Another point that you brought up to me was the best ideas come from the shop floor. And I'm like, man, like these are brilliant. Like the closer you get to the customer, the closer you get to the people working with customers, the closer you get to the nitty gritty of on the ground of what's going on. So for executives that are listening to this, these tenets, I think, are applicable for any business today. And it's not amazing to me, but it's so cool how you applied this to nonprofit and crushed it, which is awesome. And my hat's off to you, brother. It's really outstanding.
Thanks. It's a journey. We're getting better every day, but we're required to get better.
Yeah.
In the for-profit world, you can set your target on your rate of return, right? And you beat it and it's great. In the people serving world, it's never enough. So you gotta keep doing better. That's where this notion of our cultural foundation, John, is this notion of constructive discontent.
Yeah.
You have to be hearable. Can't assassinate a good message with a crappy delivery. We all have, whether it's at home or at work. We were right, but maybe I'm just projecting, but we're profoundly unhearable. And the consequences of assassinating a meritorious message with a crappy delivery in the people serving world is dire. So you got to be hearable, but you can never be satisfied. There's that Frederick Douglass notion of where there is no struggle, there is no progress. Our work requires progress. So we got to be willing to struggle, right? That's one thing that is very, very important to us. We have another corporate value or entity value that we call steering through turbulence. So if you think of a plane, right? Sometimes you got to steer into and through the turbulence, whether it's the easy flights where you just go through the cloud layer, or to get to the more efficient air, or you got to steer through into and through a part of the storm. If you're not doing it, if you feel the bumps, that means you're on the right path.
Yeah.
Right. And so we steer up into that next layer and then through the turbulence to get where we need to be to get that efficient air to land the plane. And so we tell our team, like, listen, if there's some bumps here, that means you're not just packing it in and doing the safe job. You're doing what you have to do to honor the mom role for the clients.
These are so many golden nuggets, Zach. I'm remembering our pre-call, and I'm so fired up that you're speaking to our audience. Before we go any further, because I don't know if you remember, I asked you this question. I'm like, dude, you spent all these years in education, and you and your wife are both highly educated, and you have you commit all this time and to get these degrees. And I asked you, like, where does the mentality of service come from? So not a knock on your profession at all. I'm not saying that lawyers aren't service minded. I'm not saying that. But dude, you go through all that education and then you become a public defender first. And then you drop everything and you go and you start this entity, SBP. Can you share with us a little bit of how did you figure out, like, I think you said your mom, you've mentioned the mom principle 5 times. And if I recall, I think you told me that your mother had a huge heart for service. So for our listeners, just kind of tell us, how did that manifest itself into action, that service mentality? Thanks.
And it was 2 of us. So I think part of what worked is my wife and I have very aligned values. And my wife, I think she just turned 50. I've never seen anyone accelerate into and through 50 better it's amazing how it was a springboard to even like greater growth for her. But my wife's a woman, she bought one new car in her whole life. I've never bought a new car. She grew up going to Catholic schools in Washington, D.C., and had great values. You know, her parents had 4 kids. They sent them all to great schools, but they were grounded in things that mattered. So before I talk about me, I think it's important just to note it, like the couples need to be, for us, it was the magic of we were aligned on what was important. We were aligned on what wasn't important. So I guess I want to be clear about that. You know, when I grew up, I have a great family, but my parents divorced when I was younger. When I was very young, I lived with my mom in a rented apartment in a really affluent town in Massachusetts, right next door to where Chris lives. So I was in Belmont, he's in Lexington. My grandmother lived in Lexington, and there was always a backstop. My grandparents were fine, but I kind of felt of a different ilk than some of the other families in our town because we were renting our place and my friends all had these big houses. And I was fortunate not to be in a household where I felt I needed to go make money to, you know, because we didn't have fancy cars. We didn't have a lot of stuff. We were fine, but we just didn't have fancy stuff. So it was never really in my mind that I needed a career to do that. My mother very quietly, and my dad in his own way too, took care of people. Didn't talk about it. Wasn't a big preachy thing, but my mother would go to the local, there was a baker, there was a really nice fancy baker in town, and she'd pick up the chocolate croissants and whatever was day old and bring it to a homeless shelter. And it wasn't she didn't do it as part of anything. It was just something that her conscience told her to do. Her friend group was eclectic, I guess you could say, and it wasn't based on social status. It was based on other things. My dad's the kind of guy who, if he tells you he's going to do something, it's done. And so, it's more than done. I don't know if you read the thing that's fascinating recently about Roman cement. Did you see this? Like they found the secret to Roman cement, why it's stood up for thousands of years when our cement falls apart. That's my father's commitment. If he's going to do something separately, it's worth reading, and we'll see how ancient technologies can drive what we're doing better today. So it was nothing profound. It wasn't part of a faith system. I was just lucky enough to have been exposed, but not dogmatically or doctrinally, to doing important things. I did grow up in Massachusetts, right? Like many kids in Massachusetts, you heard about the non-political way of service, whether it was right or wrong, it doesn't necessarily matter, but things were romanticized in a way. And so I was fortunate enough, like, listen, public defenders, at least where I was in DC, still make plenty of money. We were solidly middle class, but I never had aspirations because it was never really on the table. And maybe I wasn't thinking far enough down the road, but it just wasn't what was on our priorities. And we knew people. I guess the other thing for me is my family is racially diverse. There's a biracial family. My mother's sister married an African-American guy who was my uncle, who had a daughter who was my cousin, and in a small family, we were raised similar. We were raised very close, but I saw how the world treated us differently. And she was smarter than, she's passed away out of a terrible car accident, tragically. But she was older, she was smarter, she was better looking, she was cooler, but the world treated us differently. And I heard what some of my friends where I grew up said about Black people. And so I had a little bit of red ass about that. And we can, Rachel, edit that out. I had, it struck me in a way that I think, the more I think of it, influenced the way I wanted to spend my time in the world.
Yeah, and I think the people that you've touched on the legal side, so we'll just kind of briefly talk about this. But one of the things that when I did some research, and we did some research on you, there's a Mr. Howard walking around today who is an incredible story. You had an incredible impact on his life. And I know you're probably not used to talking about it in a glorified way, and I don't want you to feel compelled to do that. But one of the things you're pretty well known for in your circles from a legal perspective is a highly publicized wrongful conviction case that you championed in Mr. Howard. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, so it was a team. I should be really clear about that. It was a team. And we got a law firm that really sort of rocket charged it. But I got a call, I think when this was, in 2005, early 2005, from a judge, great judge, Jeb Boasberg, who's now a federal, I think he's a security clearance judge, but great guy, former U.S. attorney, who said, hey, Mr. Rosenburg, I want you to look into this matter. And I read it was a long file. Read the file. Long story short, 4 people were convicted in a murder where all the evidence, ballistic evidence, eyewitness evidence, not all, the vast majority of the evidence indicated 3 people did the killing. Right, and I'll give you some examples. Ballistics, 3 guns. Eyewitness statements. 15 witnesses said 3 guys, 2 witnesses, brother and sister, who one was on escape from the mental institution. The other was working off a crack cocaine charge. Said there were 2 guys, or my guy was there. Mike Howard was there. I just read this before I even met Mike. At trial, one of those 2, when they said, who is Mr. Howard? They pointed to the wrong guy. Never should have been convicted. The case never should have been arrested, let alone never should have been convicted. Never should have been tried together. So I read the file. I thought, this will be something. So I go in to meet Mike. And there's a lot of misconceptions about the people in jail. But from the moment I met him, Mike was one of the most self-composed, dignified, peaceful guys I'd ever met. And we talked for about an hour and a half that first day. And I'd given Mike a legal pad to take notes. And at one point, I saw a tear go from his eye to his cheek to the legal pad. I said, Mr. Howard, what's going on? And he said he had hope. First time. At that point, I think he was in for 19 or 20 years. And then I was freaked. It hit at a different level. So long story short, I investigated the heck out of the case. Each of the co-defendants wrote a letter, signed letter, and were willing to testify they did it. Mike didn't. The mother of the brother and the sister were ready, or said, rather, I'm sorry, I'm fast forwarding. Listen, Bobby was home that night and Wanda was doing so. It was Bobby Thompson and Wanda something. The mother made clear that they couldn't have been there that night. And early on in the case, I went to the U.S. attorney, who was a good guy, or the assistant U.S. attorney. I said, Tony, I'm going to give you everything. My guy didn't do it. So I kept feeding him the truth and my witnesses. And at that point, this is important. This is hideous, but this is important. He put a cold case detective on it. Great guy, Jim Trainer. He investigates the case. And about a month before trial, before the hearing, and then I got a law firm Venable with Seth Rosenthal, a guy I knew who's a rugby playing buddy of a guy I used to play rugby with. And Seth brought his whole team, which was incredible. But a month before the hearing, the cold case detective said, I'm going to testify for you guys. Your guy didn't do it.
Wow.
About 10 days before the hearing, Tony Quinn calls up, who was the U.S. attorney's great guy. I said, Zack, I'm withdrawing from the case. I said, why is that? I said, well, I can't stand behind the jury verdict. I said, well, Tony, if you can't stand behind the jury verdict, it's really easy, man. Don't oppose our motion. Well, I can't do that. My boss won't let me do that. Mm. And so the presidentially appointed U.S. attorney, we went in to go see him, and he said, you know what? We stand behind the jury verdict, but I'll make you a deal. Your guy drops his appeal. He does 2 years and he'll come home.
2 more years.
2 more years. We said, pound sand. We said, no, we'll go talk to Mike, but no. Came back and saw him again. He said, all right, here's the deal. This is the last offer. He can go home in 2 days, or we'll try it. But if we try it and you win, I'm going to appeal, and he's going to do at least another year.
It's criminal.
So we took that to our client, and Mike said, I want to go home. And so never pled guilty because he didn't do it. He pled, in essence, a no contest. They reduced the charge, and Mike's out. But because of human lack of courage, he has a conviction and wasn't the benefit of all that comes with exoneration. Now, Mike is living, that's the crime here, is living a peaceful life. He's working, he's supporting his family. But I will tell you this, the world is better with Mike on the outside than it is on the inside. He came to our wedding. He spent his 50th birthday helping to work on our office in New Orleans. And he's truly one of the finest and most peaceful men I know. And if that judge hadn't given the file a chance, our world would be worse because Mike wouldn't be with all of us. But it still hasn't treated him the right way.
Well, Zack, I appreciate you sharing that story. And, we can do another podcast on the thousands or millions of people that are, that get wrongfully convicted. And then the only way to get out is to say that they, no contest or what have you, they still hold a conviction of something over their head. So I'm not going to dig into that political aspect. I just want to say to you kind of publicly here, you were born to be an advocate. And this world is so much better off that's the path that you took. Hey, Johnny, would you kind of dive us back into the volunteerism, of SBP?
Oh, yeah, sure. But first, you left out part of the punchline. Did they catch the guy that did it?
Well, the 3 guys who did it were in jail.
Okay.
So 4 people were convicted, 3 did it.
Okay.
They got
part of their testimony, guys. Right? The guys that got convicted. They said he wasn't there, which is goodness. That's cool.
Okay. Yeah, Zack, I mean, you amassed a giant volunteer network. You built a real community, with your organization. Talk a little bit about the keys to building that type of organization and an extended volunteer network. That can't be easy, and it must be something that you constantly work on as a leader.
We do constantly work on creating the best possible volunteer experience we can. I'll tell you, so we were just talking about my criminal defense experience, right? I was a jaded dude, right? How could I not have been? I saw what wasn't working. Let me tell you what worked. As soon as Liz and I got to New Orleans and said, we're going to start helping people, we were inundated with volunteers, right? We had this, it was 2 of us, a guy named Matt, and then Linda Golden, who was on her way to Peace Corps. And she had 6 months. She was the volunteer coordinator. We were like nothing. We were just volunteers. No one was getting paid. Linda, we had 100 volunteers a day, easily.
Then you had the hippies. You had the hippies too.
And we had the hippies too. We had everybody. I mean, Liz and I sometimes go back and we think through, oh my goodness. But that's a good point, John. Right? There was no American demographic that didn't show up to help.
Right.
There was every faith or view on living, faith or no faith, every racial background, every economic background. What changed my worldview was seeing these American people from all around the world, but American people coming to help, saying there's people in need and there's a one-to-one correlation. And that's the key between me volunteering and a human result. Never once did someone say, I really want to help, but how did your client vote? Right? What do they think about this social issue?
Yeah, who cares?
None of that stuff.
Yeah.
What really, so you asked how we built the volunteer experience, that we did have to help this endemic human American compulsion to drive impact, as long as they see, and this is the key, guys, a one-to-one correlation between what they're doing and human impact. Now, since COVID, it's taken us a while to restart that piece of the work. We're rebuilding houses now in 9 communities across the country, plus the Bahamas. But it took us a while to restart that volunteer component. But once we did, they're out in gangbusters again. And our secret sauce there, besides the value of, well, there's a few things we do, but the real engine to volunteerism for SVP is having AmeriCorps members. And I don't know if you or your listeners know what AmeriCorps is. In essence, it's the domestic Peace Corps.
Okay.
These are folks 18 to 80, at least the type that work with us, who commit to spending 10 months of their life for really a stipend. It's not even a salary, helping others. Most of them are post-college, but we've had nuns, we have had doctors, we have people at all phases of their career. And they're the rebuilding part of what we do. They're the infrastructure. They're the volunteer coordinators, the site supervisors, the logistic people, the folks working with the clients. And they create this dynamic that makes volunteering magic. I mean, I got from I'm in Puerto Rico right now, and I got a video a couple months ago from the Puerto Rican AmeriCorps members with the volunteers here. And they were dancing with the volunteers. They'd build for an hour and then take a 5-minute dancing break. It was this bonding. Like, when we think about this country and there's anything we're concerned about, I really encourage you and the listeners to think of AmeriCorps and think of the spirit of post-disaster volunteering, not just with us, with others. Now, let's talk about that, Zack. We have a robust network of listeners. How can they help you and help your organization and what you're doing? Yeah, there's 3 things they can do. First of all, they can come volunteer. They can come in New Orleans. They can come in Florida, Puerto Rico, Texas. They can come in the Bahamas, in St. Vincent, part of the Grenadine. We're turning volcanic ashes into construction blocks. So we're taking that which destroyed the community and we're rebuilding with, but they can come volunteer. Second of all, and when they're volunteering, you can either volunteer and build houses. If nothing feels better, it's a great guys trip, families trip, father, son, mother, daughter trip. We've had bachelorette parties. We just wrapped up our 12th nuns build, where we have Catholic sisters come from all around the country building houses. Anyone can do this. So they can volunteer by building, or they can also do their own version of the partnership with Toyota. And lots of companies do this, where they take their best asset, their people, and they engage in a skill-based volunteering network. We have a finance team, we have a social media team, we have a strategy we're working on. Most companies are excellent at something, and your people could help us. So in some way, volunteer. Certainly financially investing, either for a specific client or for a specific program, is all terrific. It's a great thing for a company or a family to focus on. I'm going to get the Smith family home, and it feels like $1 million. It really is the but for. Without your support, this family wouldn't be moving home.
And can we get the link to that for our listeners? We can put it in the show notes.
The website is www.sbpusa.org. Okay. They can email me, Zack at sbpusa.org.
And Zack, just for point of reference, how much to build a home, roughly? Average?
It's different in every community, but between $10,000 and $20,000 will get a family back home. Right?
Come on, peeps. For our listeners, come on, peeps.
It's doable. Come to a welcome home party.
Let's go.
What we'll do is send John some links of welcome home parties if you want to attach it to the clip when it's done. Tell you nothing feels better. We just finished our 250th client in Puerto Rico. We also have a fund focused only on veterans called the I Got Your Back Fund that was capitalized by Viatris, which is a pharmaceutical company, formerly Mylan, now Viatris. Right. Their former CEO, Heather Bresch, was a tremendous supporter starting in West Virginia. And the current leadership team has doubled down on that relationship, and they capitalized the I Got Your Back Fund. American veterans are a good portion of our clients. However, they always think someone else has to go first. I mean, every community we've worked in, you come upon a veteran, you see they're in need, and they say, well, this guy needs it more than I do. So the way we've found to maybe help them the best is have a fund that's only for veterans, so people can invest in the I Got Your Back Fund. The third way to help is let us help your people. It's free. Business continuity now, people in this day and age wouldn't build a factory or an office in an environmentally dangerous place. But with a work from home environment and with the changing weather patterns, too many of our employees, all of our employees, are living in places where their homes are at risk of being impacted by disaster. Our learnings, right, around making homes more resilient, getting the right insurance, and then after disaster and navigating FEMA, the truth about mold, can be part of your business continuity plan for the company. And it's all free. We have the Equip app. We do webinars, and we'll work directly with your company's people to make sure they understand risk before disaster and can navigate recovery. That helps us by helping more people.
That's awesome, Zack.
Hey, Zack, we're just going to wrap up here, and I'm going to turn it back over to Johnny to close it up. But I wrote down on my notes here a quote from Martin Luther King, which is one of my favorites, and I just felt like it spoke to me while you were talking here in the last hour with us. Man's most urgent and profound question is, what are you doing for others? And I knew this was the way that the podcast was going to go down. I knew what was going to come out, that like emotional connection. And it was even stronger than I had anticipated. So thank you for what you do for others. Thanks for carving out time. You're in flipping Puerto Rico right now, serving others and, working through internet issues and all kinds of things. And we could not be more grateful to you for spending time with us. Well done.
Yeah,
John, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, Zack, for me, as I described earlier, it really hit home. Having been right in the middle of, the Hurricane Ian. And then, like I said, up in Massachusetts, I had a house that was flooded. So I want to thank you on behalf of all the people that you serve and all the things that you give them, these people that are emotional and in dire need and don't know which way to turn. So thank you on behalf of those people. And thanks for sharing that with our audience. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the great work that you guys do. And let's meet up and build a house together. Let's get you home first, John. But we can, let's get to work.
You haven't seen Kaplan swing a hammer, have you? You have to give him something else.
It's all good intentions, Zack. It's all good intentions, brother.
I believe in you.
Hey, we're going to put all that in the show notes, the connections to everything you said,
Great.
The special fund for veterans, which spoke to me personally, links to everything you talked about. And we just thank you again so much for carving out the time. And for all those listening, we thank you as well to listening to another episode of Revenue Builders.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Be sure to check us out at forcemanagement.com.